Hi, I'm David Smith, and this is In a Word. I love the scheme of redemption, and I love the story of redemption, and some of my favorite words in the Bible are those words connected to the scheme of redemption, especially in a very intrinsic and a very intimate way. When you're studying the scheme of redemption and you want to talk about blood or atonement, I love those words. There is a word that is connected to the scheme of redemption in the Bible. It is not a word that you hear people use often, but it is so absolutely essential to the scheme of redemption. It's the word propitiation. Have you ever read that word in the Bible? In fact, in translation in the New Testament, it only appears one time in the New Testament. It's in Romans chapter 3 and verse 25. And here's what Paul says. Whom God hath set forth to be a propitiation through faith in His blood, to declare His righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. Propitiation. Very interesting word. The word itself, the root of that word, carries the idea of an appeasement. It carries the idea of being merciful, at least in the root form of that word. The word itself in translation means an expiatory sacrifice. And it's interesting because the word involved, at least in a picture, the idea of appeasing the anger of someone else. An offense has been committed, someone is angry at the offense of another, and some object is being offered so as to appease the anger of the other toward the offense, so that the anger is subsided, the anger doesn't exist anymore. And that word picture is drawn off of by Paul in Romans 3:25 to emphasize something about the scheme of redemption, and more especially the Lord's part in what He became for us to appease the anger of God toward us. Now, the only other time that I'm aware that that word is used in the New Testament is in the book of Hebrews, but it appears in a little bit different translation. In Hebrews chapter 9, verse 5, the writer says, and over it the cherubims of glory shadowing the, notice, mercy seat. That's the same word translated propitiation back in Romans 3, verse 25. And then the writer says, of which we cannot now speak particularly. Now, the mercy seat, of course, was overshadowed by the cherubims, those images that stood over the mercy seat, and as the high priest would go in, he would sprinkle the mercy seat with the blood of animals, and he would make atonement for the people. But notice you have the idea of a covering. You have the blood. All of those are connected elements. The imagery there of atonement being made for the people. So there's certainly a history to the word suggesting the use of a covering and suggesting the appeasing of the anger of God. And so that's the picture that Paul draws from when he goes to Romans chapter 3 and says that now Jesus is our propitiation. So I want you to look at Romans 3 with me, and I want you to understand how this propitiation works today. Obviously, in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, Paul writes and says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The problem that calls for the need of propitiation is sin. Now, when he says all here, he doesn't mean babies. He's not talking about those who are not of an accountable stage of life. He means accountable people, people who have the ability to make the choice and choose to do the wrong thing. And when they do that, all people who have done that, when they sin, they move backward away from the glory of God. So there's a need for the anger of God to be appeased. In Romans 3:26, Paul says, to declare, I say, at this time His righteousness, that He might be just and the justifier of them which believe in Jesus. Now, notice that God is just. It means that in order to be a just God, He must require the penalty for sin. Yet in the same passage, he says that He's the justifier of them that believe in Jesus. If He's the one that sets the conditions of pardon, He can allow the conditions of pardon to include a way for man to escape the penalty as long as that penalty is paid by another. That's where Jesus comes into the picture. Now, when He does this, He's certainly being better to man than man deserves. In Romans 3:24, he says, being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Obviously, the Lord does something for us that we cannot do of ourselves, and He offers that to us freely by His grace. He is better to us than we deserve to be treated. That's the definition here of grace. It does not mean only by grace, but freely by grace. He offers it freely toward all men. There's still conditions of pardon. That's where he comes back to verse 25 and says, whom God hath set forth to be a propitiation through faith in His blood, to declare His righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. The only way to appease the demands of the scheme of redemption, which called for the shedding of blood to appease the anger of God toward man, was through Jesus Christ. But notice in this passage he talks about the remission of sins. How do we receive the remission of sins? Acts 2:38, we're baptized for the remission of sins. So to receive the benefit of that, we have to obey. But the only way that you and I ever have the chance of having the anger of God appeased toward us, of having it subsided so that God and man could be brought back together, was by the work of Jesus in becoming a propitiation, that object that appeases the anger of God. That's such a great word. And I hope that even though it appears one time in the Bible, that the next time you're reading the book of Romans, you will not overlook that word. It's extremely important to the scheme of redemption. Propitiation. That's been our word for the day. I'm David Smith, and this is In a Word.